You don't replay certain relationships because you're still in love. That's the explanation people usually reach for. The simple answer. The comfortable answer. But for a lot of bisexual people, especially those carrying years of identity conflict, emotional masking, and relationship uncertainty, the truth is often much darker than that. Because what keeps returning isn't always the person. Sometimes it's the version of yourself that existed with them. The version that almost felt understood. The version that almost felt chosen. The version that almost felt safe. And almost is a dangerous word, because the human mind struggles to let go of unfinished emotional experiences, especially the ones that shaped your identity. Especially the ones that happened while you were still trying to figure out who you were allowed to be. Years later, a random song plays. A familiar city appears on your screen. You see someone who vaguely resembles them, and suddenly you're back there. Not physically, psychologically, reliving conversations, replaying arguments, reconstructing moments, editing scenes, searching for answers your younger self never found. And the strange part is that sometimes the relationship itself wasn't even healthy. Sometimes it wasn't stable. Sometimes it wasn't loving. Yet your mind keeps returning anyway. Because memory is not a museum. Memory is an investigation. And unresolved emotions never stop collecting evidence. For many bisexual people, relationships become attached to much more than romance. They become attached to identity, validation, belonging, visibility, proof, especially if that relationship existed during a period when you were still questioning yourself, still hiding, still translating your identity into language other people could understand, or trying to. Because one of the least discussed experiences among bisexual people is emotional translation fatigue. The exhaustion of constantly explaining yourself. Explaining that attraction isn't confusion. Explaining that fluidity isn't inconsistency. Explaining that uncertainty doesn't automatically mean deception. Over time, that creates something subtle. You stop looking for connection. You start looking for relief. Relief from being questioned. Relief from being interpreted. Relief from having your identity treated like a debate topic. And when someone briefly gives you that relief, your nervous system notices. Even if the relationship eventually falls apart. Even if the person leaves. Even if they hurt you. A part of your mind remembers the temporary safety. And safety is addictive when you've spent years feeling emotionally examined. That's why certain relationships become difficult to release. Not because they were perfect, because they were meaningful. There's a difference. A massive difference. Modern culture often assumes people revisit relationships because they can't move on. But sometimes they're revisiting emotional landmarks. Moments where their identity felt real. Moments where they stopped shrinking themselves. Moments where they stopped editing every sentence before speaking. Moments where they weren't performing, just existing. The relationship ends. The memory stays. And eventually the memory becomes larger than reality. Quietly, without permission, without awareness. This is where replaying starts becoming something else. Something darker. Because after enough time, many people stop replaying what happened. They start replaying what could have happened. The alternate timeline. The life that almost existed. The conversation they wish they had. The boundary they never set. The truth they never shared. The chance they never took. And the brain is exceptionally good at manufacturing emotional ghosts. It can create entire worlds from unfinished possibilities. entire futures from abandoned potential, especially during loneliness, especially at night, especially after another disappointing dating experience. Because modern dating has created a new psychological problem. People now have more access to potential partners than ever before. And yet many feel less emotionally secure than previous generations. Dating apps promise abundance. But abundance often creates comparison. Comparison creates doubt. Doubt creates emotional monitoring. Emotional monitoring creates exhaustion. Eventually, people stop asking, "Do I like this person?" and start asking, "Am I making the right choice?" That question becomes particularly dangerous for bisexual individuals already carrying years of social messaging about uncertainty. The fear isn't always losing someone. The fear is choosing wrong. The fear is regretting. The fear is discovering that another version of life might have been better. So old relationships become evidence. Evidence that the mind constantly re-examines, looking for clues, looking for certainty, looking for a final answer that doesn't exist. And certainty rarely arrives, because relationships are not mathematical equations. They're emotional ecosystems. You can't solve them years later, but the brain keeps trying, again, and again, and again. What's fascinating is that many people aren't actually replaying relationships because they miss the relationship. They're replaying relationships because they miss emotional coherence. They miss a period when life felt simpler, or at least understandable. The relationship becomes a psychological container. Inside it sits youth, possibility, hope, identity formation, self-discovery, emotional risk, first experiences, lost versions of the self. When you revisit the relationship, you're often revisiting all of that. Not just one person. This is why moving on can feel strangely impossible. You're not grieving one loss. You're grieving multiple losses layered together. The person, the future, the version of yourself, the emotional certainty, the imagined outcome, the unanswered questions. That's a lot for a nervous system to carry. And modern life gives people very little space to process it. Instead, distraction arrives instantly. Notifications, content, validation loops, endless scrolling, the illusion of connection, the illusion of progress. People remain socially connected while emotionally unresolved. People remain visible while psychologically unseen. People remain busy while internally stuck. That contradiction changes people. Slowly. Because unresolved emotions don't disappear. They adapt. Sometimes they become anxiety. Sometimes hypervigilance. Sometimes reassurance addiction. Sometimes emotional numbness. And sometimes they become endless replay. A private documentary running inside the mind. One scene after another. One memory after another. One version of the story after another. Until the person can no longer tell whether they're remembering the relationship or reconstructing it. That's the hidden danger. Memory feels objective. But memory is emotional. It edits, removes, adds, protects, distorts, especially when loneliness becomes chronic. Because loneliness has a strange effect on memory. It softens sharp edges. It romanticizes complexity. It turns ambiguity into significance. And suddenly a relationship that once caused confusion begins looking like clarity. A relationship that once felt unstable begins looking like certainty. A relationship that once felt painful begins looking like safety. Not because reality changed, because emotional hunger changed. The mind starts feeding itself nostalgia. And nostalgia is one of the most convincing emotional illusions ever created. It doesn't show you what happened. It shows you what feels missing. That's why people can become trapped for years. Not inside a relationship. Inside a memory that keeps evolving. A memory that keeps demanding interpretation. A memory that refuses to stay in the past. Because deep down, the replay was never really about them. It was about the unresolved emotional questions they left behind. Questions about identity. Questions about worth. Questions about belonging. Questions about being fully known. And those questions don't disappear when a relationship ends. They follow people into new relationships, into new cities, into new versions of themselves, sometimes for years. Maybe that's the darkest realization of all. The relationship wasn't the thing your mind couldn't let go of. It was the emotional investigation that relationship started. And investigations don't end when the suspect disappears. They end when the truth is finally found. The uncomfortable truth is that most people aren't haunted by former partners. They're haunted by unfinished versions of themselves. The versions that still live inside those memories. Waiting, watching, asking the same question they've been asking for years. What exactly was I looking for back then? Because sometimes the answer isn't love. Sometimes it was understanding. Sometimes it was safety. Sometimes it was permission to exist without explanation. And when a person spends enough of their life feeling emotionally translated instead of emotionally understood, that kind of permission becomes unforgettable. Not because it lasted, because it was rare. And rare emotional experiences have a way of surviving long after the people attached to them are gone.